very important to you all. And the motion is how to put a moratorium on mergers and acquisitions in the social media industry. We've got NTU-A in the government and other SSM in the opposition. Without further ado, I invite the Prime Minister to open the case on the opposition side.
Mr. Speaker, we think key harms exist in the status quo when we see so many mergers and acquisitions taking place in the social media industry, and we think moratoriums then are essential to mitigate these harms in the short run. And we think after these moratoriums are lifted, we think the social media landscape in the industry will reach an equilibrium point where we don't think that such a moratorium will be necessary. The end goal that we need to achieve here, and this is important, is the protection of users of social media, and secondly, the protection of the industry as well, where we prevent unnecessary monopolistic or oligopolistic tendencies taking over, because we think they're extremely harmful. So the model we have for you today is really simple. We think that we're going to place a moratorium of about 5 to 10 years where social media companies will be banned from merging or acquiring with other companies. In the meantime, we are going to go ahead with a vast campaign of educating people for information literacy to tell them about the uses and the implications of using social media and the impact that social media really has on their lives, because we think that's something that's sorely lacking in the status quo. Now, I have 3 main arguments for you today. Firstly, we'll be looking at what the social media landscape really is and what are the needs of this landscape. Secondly, we'll be telling you why a moratorium is a good policy to go ahead to meet these end goals of protecting users and this industry. And thirdly, we'll be looking at the vast harms that come about from mergers and acquisitions in this area. Right? And under those, I have 3 harms to talk to you about. We're coming to the first idea then about the social media landscape. And let's really look at the usage of social media in our lives today. Now we have to understand one thing. We think currently with current generations as well as older generations find a lot of relatability with the virtual world by means of social media, which means that social media is an all-encompassing representation of a person's life, right? From the person's personal information to his opinions, to his personality, to his social life. Every aspect of an individual's life is now documented through social media, through things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. So basically, you see that the everyday life of an individual is documented and collated by means of social media, and that makes social media an extremely powerful tool, and we have to be really, really careful with that. But the second thing is that social media is also a really good avenue of bringing out information to people. We think that it's also a really strong way of people connecting with one another and finding out about things. So it is slowly also taking on the place of other kinds of traditional media too. But no, sit down. But also, we have to look at the industry of social media as well. Now, we see that social media really started out about 10 years ago, but it really caught on about 5 to 6 years ago when things like Facebook got popular, right? When it overtook things like MySpace and Friendster and whatnot. And as its popularity increased, the pervasiveness of this industry also increased. At the same time, we saw that new companies started to come up about 5 to 6 years ago, which means that at this point in time, in 2014, you've got companies who are mildly successful, and these companies are the ones who are being taken over rapidly. So whether it was the acquisition of Foursquare, whether it was the acquisition of Instagram, and recently WhatsApp as well. So we see that the industry is in a flux, and we think that this trend of mergers and acquisitions is extremely harmful. And that's why we need a moratorium to really put things in place. And this brings me to my second argument of why a moratorium is a good and effective policy to prevent these mergers and acquisitions. Now we have to understand a moratorium is a really time-sensitive solution, which means that after 4 to 10 years, we expect people to, we are more than happy with companies taking over each other or merging at that point. No, thank you. Now we think the reason why we need to have a time-sensitive policy is this. At this point in time, when different companies when different social media companies are giving users different avenues of using their product, we need to encourage that. We need to allow them to grow. We need to prevent them from being taken over or being acquired by bigger, more established social media companies like Facebook and Google and whatnot, right? Well, Google's not really. Anyway, so the point is, the thing is, we need to protect smaller companies at this point in time so that they can grow, so that they're given a chance to grow and they're given a chance to prosper and become successful, and preventing them and insulating them from these bigger companies. And we have lots of precedents for this. We see this happening with the oil companies back in the 80s as well. We saw this happening, we saw this happening with other industries such as the supermarkets in the 90s and in the early 2000s. We saw this happening in many other sectors where competition was absolutely essential for the sustenance of that industry. And we think then that's what justifies a moratorium. Once you give these smaller social media companies the chance, another 5 to 10 years to grow and acquire their potential, we think that it's going to be much better for them to sustain. Thank you. Now coming to my third argument about the harms of these mergers in social media, right? And now the first harm we have to look at is how these mergers and the trend of oligopolies hurts consumers' choice. Now we have to understand this. Once you have one single corporation or perhaps 2 or 3 corporations controlling the entire scene of social media, consumers no longer have a choice to really determine what they want to use. They're forced to use only certain kinds of social media products, and that's extremely harmful. We don't see why. We see that to ensure corporations still exist within this industry, that's the best way for governments to really step in. Before I move on, if there's a POI.
Yeah. You say you want to protect these small startups from these hostile takeovers. Or were they hostilely taken over? Or were they equitable, agreeable agreements where both sides eventually benefited?
So now, it doesn't matter. We don't care if they were taken over amicably or not. We still think a takeover is bad. And this brings me on to my second harm, which is extremely crucial. Mr. Speaker, we think that this concentration of a person's entire life that is documented through social media remaining in the hands of one company is extremely bad. We think the propensity for abuse in this case is really high, and that's what we need to prevent here, Mr. Speaker. So we don't care how this merger happened. We think it's still extremely detrimental for users to have all of their information, all of their life being documented in one company who holds all these records, which makes it extremely vulnerable for attacks on these individuals' lives by the theft of this information and by the abuse of this information. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, we think that another big harm that comes out of these acquisitions and mergers is what happens to discourse. When you've got a form of media conglomerates forming within the social media landscape, we think it is extremely detrimental. It's like having one state newspaper. It's like having one state broadcasting channel, which only gives individual that one idea or that one form of information. And we think that the same thing is replicated in the social media landscape, we're then completely diminishing the power of social media as being a good tool to bring out information to individuals, and that's something we need to prevent. We think the harms that come about of mergers and acquisitions in the short term are extremely great, and that's why a moratorium is necessary. Very happy to propose.
Thank the Prime Minister for a speech and invite the position.
Mr. Speaker, I have a great affinity for the usage of social media services in which we all share banal facts about ourselves. And it's the exact characteristic of social media industry which the affirmative team has failed ultimately to analyze in this debate. I have 5 points of rebuttal to that case, but what I'm going to talk about today is very simple. We support no restrictive policies on mergers and acquisitions on this side of the house, especially in the industry of social media sites. Before moving on to my substantive points, let's look at a lot of rebuttals I have for these guys. The first one is on the model. What we heard from them was they would set a moratorium because 5 to 10 years is an adequate period for encouraging competition. Like, the ever-changing nature of social media industries point to the fact there are always new hot competitors emerging. So after 5 to 10 years, there will always be a new Facebook. There would always be a new competitor. So we think in terms of effectiveness, their policy doesn't stand. But on this campaign of literacy, that we don't need to go and educate individuals about how they're supposed to use social media sites. People choose what they like, and people know how to use social media sites. If you want to increase consumer choice, the exact thing that you should take is encouraging mergers and acquisitions that encourage innovation and spur development. Second point of rebuttal. Their argument that they have to protect small companies from bigger companies. And this was sort of the argument against monopolies and oligopolies, which they never analyzed. 5 reasons as to why monopolies and oligopolies don't exist in social media industries in terms of the same characteristics as ours. Firstly, because unlike oil companies, social media industries don't operate on owning infrastructure and factors of production. So there is no idea of owning infrastructure and restricting competition. There isn't the case of monopoly in that sense. But secondly, startup costs are incredibly low. It's very easy to enter the social media industry because all you have to do is use cloud computing for databases and actually know a lot about computers as a graduate of Stanford. Thirdly, the nature of product competition in social media is based on having entrepreneurial ideas and finding new niche markets. Because the consumer consideration set is so diverse, it's very easy to segment and devise a new way to compete against the bigger companies. In fact, WhatsApp was considered as a huge competitor to Facebook before Mark Zuckerberg decided to get it because Facebook had a shitty idea of using message programs. And it's not like the idea that small companies are unable to compete. Like, WhatsApp was on a bigger leveraging position when it decided to join Facebook. So we just don't agree with the idea that small companies aren't able to compete. In fact, in the social media industry, the biggest threat to big companies that are fat and not capable of innovating is small companies. And small companies can always leverage that. They can choose to go alone, like Facebook did when it was a startup, or just go and merge with other companies. We're fine with that. Then they gave us this argument about consumer choice protection. Firstly, we think it's the choice of consumers if they want to use convenient and popular programs that attract a lot of market share. But secondly, there's always diversity in the social media industry. One, because the product life cycle is very short, because the pace of innovation is so quick, because there's always a way for bigger companies to fall. MySpace was the most popular social media site until it got clouded out by other companies that were emerging startups like Facebook. But also, like, the quality of service is so diverse that it's unable for big companies to compete. They were considering, like, the idea of Facebook taking over the market. That's not true. Programs like WeChat and Viber in China are actually the dominant ones, and we don't think there's a lack of competition in that case. The one industry where big companies and small companies can compete fairly is actually the social media industry, and we don't see any necessity from their proposal on that side of the house. Then we have this idea that information abuse is a huge problem. 3 responses. 1, regulated by law, which is just a proposal that was submitted by Obama's group last month. Secondly, the problem with information abuse and leaks is a problem with credit card companies and banks that have a lot of consumer information, not social networking sites. Thirdly, if you aren't clear about this, the biggest revealing of private information was done by the US government, which required telecom companies like Verizon, which virtually have the information of every consumer existing in the status quo. That was a problem of government. It's not related to social networking sites. And if you support the idea of consumers using a lot of information, the information is always going to be stored by social networking sites, so we don't think your model solves that. 2 substantive points on this side of the house. Firstly, why this is an ineffective, unnecessary intervention in the market. Secondly, why this is not better for consumers. We think mergers and acquisitions are important for 3 reasons. Firstly, because it happens when there are ineffective business practices and companies need more financing power. We think businesses hurt together because they think they can get more financing powers. We think because they can increase their stock revenue so that they can have more money to innovate and compete with. This is why mergers and acquisitions are generally allowed in the market, because they exist for a good purpose. But secondly, it's especially relevant to this debate because increasing R&D is only possible through mergers and is largely possible through mergers and acquisition. Because a lot of companies see fit that it's good to merge with larger companies. Like Nokia took care of a telecom company, Google got Motorola, and that's because while startups have good ideas and while startups have good sort of niche market capacity, they don't really have the financing power, so we think it's good for the purposes of the economy that they do integrate. Yes?
That's a contradiction. Initially you say these companies don't need a lot of capital, don't need a lot of resources and infrastructure for R&D, and now suddenly you need to be a part of a big company for R&D purposes.
No, that's not a contradiction because the initial setup of the company doesn't require a lot of infrastructure. But if you think you want to spread it out to a lot of platforms, maybe if you want to have a lot more revenue, maybe you could. Like the point is, the barriers to entry isn't large, but if you want to expand your financing capacity, you're fine to do so. There's a huge distinction. For instance, it's harder to get into an old company because you need to buy out the existing infrastructure. But after competition, after emerging into the market, that's a different issue. We don't get why that's a contradiction. We also think social media companies are especially important because we think a lot of return on equity is necessary through that process. Because sometimes when you start up a company, it's because a lot of these companies are operated on basis of free price. We think this facilitates the return on equity to investors, which attracts a lot of investors. So that's why this is important. But there's a second substantive point: why it's better for consumers. We think creativity is expanded under our side of the house, where companies buy stuff that they don't have. This means that you can create a lot more value to consumers and offer consumers more innovation, more new stuff, which is always good. Which is why Facebook decided to ask WhatsApp to join them, because the messaging service on Facebook wasn't good. And because consumers have a very high switch over rate, conversion processes to other products in the social media industry, we don't think there is the oligopolistic and absolute dominant grip on consumers and consumer choice like they wanted to point out. But lastly, we think also because this is really good for consumers, because it's really inefficient to have separate platforms. It's really hard to have some sort of gaming that you're available on this device or this operating system or this social media site, which isn't available on others. We think it's inefficient to have compartmentalized services and provision of gaming services and advertisement, which is why we lower the search and transaction costs for individual consumers when we take this approach. Ladies and gentlemen, innovation exists, and it exists in the current status quo. The exact setup of the industry is beneficial to innovation and competition. We're happy to oppose.
Thank you for the opposition for the speech. I will invite the
Clearly, the end goal of both sides is the same thing: promoting diversity and competition in the industry. The one thing we never really heard from opposition was why simply claiming that mergers and acquisitions create more creativity and innovation meant that creativity and innovation actually happen. What I'm going to do in this speech is prove two things. One, that real diversity, competition, and innovation only happened when innovation of social media outlets happened separately and not under the same big name. Secondly, we're going to look at state intervention specifically and why we think state intervention is especially crucial in this particular time and especially for social media. Before that, let's deal with the numerous lies that came out in Leader of Opposition. The first lie that came out from Leader of Opposition was that people know how to use social media. Seriously? Sure. You may know how to use social media, but not everyone in society is aware of the implications of the privacy of social media. Sure, there are privacy settings, but not everyone is aware of the kinds of information put out there or the implications of the information out there. That is why the amount of crime or the amount of hurt and the amount of damage individuals face on a day-to-day basis, because of the amount of information they put on social media outlets and because of the amount of information that they willingly put on social media outlets, result in damage for them. Sit down. We think that at the end of the day, that states have a responsibility to protect individuals, and that protection dies when one singular company has the power of information from numerous platforms. Because let's make this clear, different social media outlets have different end goals. So for example, Instagram is a purely photographic visual element. WhatsApp is a purely communicative interactive messaging system. Twitter is meant mostly for news or for catching up on information. Facebook is specifically for catching up with friends or for games and certain applications. When you gather information of an individual across 4 different platforms and put them together in one big company, that company has a monopoly of every piece of information of your life ever, meaning the ability for these companies detailed private information of individuals that could affect individuals' lives. The second thing we need to look at is the issue of moratorium and time. The argument from them was, well, in 5 years there'll be other companies too. Sure, we're not stupid. We know that's the case. But we think that there are also going to be 20 other huge companies that are separate and competing with one another rather than an oligopoly of, say, Facebook and Google, where competition is far less and where you drown out every single small company. Sure, there are going to be startups in 5 years, but the chances of startups actually surviving at the end of these 5 years is a lot higher when the competition is a lot greater and they have a chance to stand by it. We'll explain that in a bit. The argument from them was, well, MySpace was one of those systems which died out because it got overcrowded by other options. No, it didn't. The reason why MySpace died was because it was one of those corporations that refused to get bought over, that refused to get acquired by another large corporation and get absorbed into the concept of mergers and acquisitions in social media. We think that that's a problem because if you choose to not be merged or be acquired by a large company, you will die out because you don't exist in the framework of social media today. That is why startups die out in social media in status quo. But the next thing they wanted to talk about was, well, it's not really a privacy threat because the state collects information too, and so do telephone companies. That's a lousy argument, right? Just because the state collects information isn't an argument for someone else to do it as well. We think that on this side, we want to protect the privacy of people, and we're happy to say that states shouldn't collect it either, and neither should telephone companies. We think that the individual's information and privacy should not be relegated to a concept of, well, some people do it, so let other people do it too. The last thing then was, well, it expands financial capacity of companies. Why do we care for companies' financial capacity expansion? The argument from them is, well, it ensures that profit is risen. Who cares? We think that as a state, we don't have a priority to put money in the pockets of a few people. We don't have any incentive or priority sit down to get any form of information, to get any form of profit for individuals if we think there's a harm that comes out of those right to profit and that right to expansion of financial capacity. We think that innovation, creativity, and diversity can happen without this expansion of financial capacity for these few large corporations, because we think these smaller corporations can do it too. And I'll explain that in a bit. The last thing then was, well, it's inefficient to have separate platforms. People are very busy on Facebook. Why make them quit it and go to WhatsApp when they want to? We think that there's information that's necessary to be divided in different platforms because they provide different services, and it's fair for individuals to have choice and diversity, to want to not have certain platforms or not be involved in certain social media sites, but be involved in others. For example, some people may be interested in only being communicative with people important to them, which means they want WhatsApp, but have no interest in things like games, apps, or giving any form of their private information to apps like Facebook. We think that they have the choice and should have the ability to separate those two platforms and not be forced to buy into one big platform and give information to them. Before we go into substantive, go.
Let's get one clarification coming from the affirmative. So you think that the demise of MySpace was because Facebook somehow, a small company, started having M&As and started to become larger and larger and forcing MySpace out?
Look, that's highly reductive. We don't think it was specifically Facebook. We don't think it was specifically a particular company. But we think that large acquisitions did happen at that time, and MySpace refused to get bought over, and we think that that's the reason why they died out. We don't think that that's extremely important in this debate because it was purely an example, and hinging a debate on that is rather stupid. Let's go into protecting diversity and competition in industry. We think that startup social media companies need two things. One, time to gather momentum because they need to grasp an audience, but two, they need to carve a niche for themselves to remain sustainable and maintain their key audience. What happens when M&As happen? A, the ability to carve that niche is impacted because it's not a game or an app anymore. It's a Facebook game or a Facebook app, which means it results in restrictions or limited innovation to fit the existing framework of Facebook, to fit the existing framework of that larger acquisition company. You're not leveraging or competing anymore because your limited scope for innovation is impacted. But secondly, your startup owners become extremely short-sighted and sell to make a quick buck, which means they enter and quit the industry in 4 years. The result is a limit in choice, a result is a limit in innovation and actual long-term sustainable development of companies, because sustainability is then transferred over to a bigger company and we assume that the bigger company is going to do it. The state is allowed to intervene in times of consumer protection and is allowed to intervene to break up monopolies and oligopolies. We do it all the time. It's the same as social media. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for the speech and the
I can be mean today, right? Mr. Speaker, what you saw from the affirmative from two speakers, what we define as financial illiteracy. They don't know what they're talking about. Therefore, they're coming up with ideas like, they had oil mergers with super majors in the 1980s. I guess it's the same thing because, it's big. It's not that case. My first speaker already told you that the stark differences within this industry is initially, social networking sites are not the characteristics of monopolies. Simple reason. Two factors. Number one, normally monopolies are dangerous because they control over the sources of production, like oil companies or like resources. Facebook is a server network that collects subscriptions and usually gets their income streams from advertisements and traffic from networking. So first of all, we don't know how they get this monopoly. If that worked, MySpace shouldn't have gone away because they had initially at that phase a monopoly on the social networking site network. Why did Facebook suddenly pop up? The simple reason was MySpace wasn't cool and hip anymore, and people moved over. Number two, this is another factor they keep on forgetting. The reason why super majors in the 1980s were restricted from all these acts was because there actually was a problem with monopolies where you have price fixing. When a company has an income source where you have incomes and you can control prices, yes, maybe monopolies might be a problem. Social networking sites don't get their income revenues from pricing. They're basically free. And whenever you want to price something in these industries, people move. That's why probably things like MySpace or Google Plus or in Korea, places like Cyro or FreeChow, all these competitors die out the moment they try to introduce weird new schemes and try to directly derive income pricing from this. Yes, ma'am?
Why would you then have a problem with media monopolies as well? Because they control all information, and that's bad as well. Would you accept that?
We don't have a problem with media mergers. And the second thing is that there's so much of a problem, there's always a competition. There's MNBC for the liberal hippies, and we have Fox News Network for the Tea Partiers. There is also a difference in terms of taste and issues like that. That's not a really big of an issue. Let me go to the second problem. They talked about, well, we can't converge all this information because, I don't know, the terrorists might go and pick it all up. First of all, I don't know. Why is Facebook knowing what kind of stuff you ate for lunch on Instagram or 37 selfies suddenly going to expand your danger levels? I don't get what this is. You say, oh, too much information, too much information. Now Twitter feeds about, I don't like them, I don't know, Sarah Jessica Parker is also going to expand my danger patches. Don't talk about vague or generalities, or they actually not explain what those dangers are. Second of all, this is a problem with the industry not having one or two service providers. You have 17 to 700 service providers. You'll still have this problem with SNS sites, but people just have this ADHD problem where they can't stop fucking posting things up on the Facebook wall. Another thing. We also talked about this problem about Zynga, or they like specialize into Facebook. Zynga, first of all, is a contractual partner. They weren't merged with Facebook, so we always have these relationships. Second of all, even if you don't have mergers and acquisitions, you have contractual relationships between companies to be able to lease or charter or trade or sell private information or intellectual property. So if they're going to stop all of that as well, well, go ahead, but you're also going to kill the industry as well. And the final thing that we want to talk about in this aspect is pretty interesting because they talk about, well, you know, startups and innovation. We'll talk about this in our argument, how this is actually the opposite. But finally, this whole aspect of MySpace, let's get over this MySpace thing. MySpace died out because they didn't let somebody buy them out. First of all, that's a problem, right? If you want these industries, because they want SNS sites too, if you want these industries to survive, clearly they didn't have the funding or the money to actually survive. In this case, maybe they should have allowed someone to merger and acquisition. Second of all, they were arguing like Facebook was the competition. Facebook was this small when MySpace went away. They got bigger, and they're not bought by anyone. They had their own IPO for freaking out loud. They weren't merged by anyone. They're doing it on their own when they can do so. So that out of the way. Our argument is basically this. How their whole argument about monopolies in normal situations cut off innovation is totally the opposite situation when it comes to SNSs. I'll tell you what. This is an accounting approach on thinking about how startups start. Yes, The entry level initially is low because all you need is a few techies that graduated from, I don't know, engineering school and a few servers. But the problem is, if you think about it, you have two ways of starting up any business. It's usually that you borrow money and therefore you need to have a return on assets from banks, or you need to have your initial partners to put up equity to start a company. So either way, you need to start your thing, you need to buy your servers, and you need to have the program. Here's the problem. Places like WhatsApp has to wait if they are going to succeed in any way. Its entry level is low, but they'll have to have a humongous amount of time hemorrhaging their income because until they build a certain amount of traction, they're not going to touch any money anytime soon. The problem with places like Facebook, even Facebook had a problem with initial income streams going in, is because they don't get to price their services. They need to rely on networks and therefore advertising costs. WhatsApp probably had to wait for a few years, which probably then they would probably died out. The problem is this is a mainstream issue where all of these people have these innovative ideas they want to try out, but they're not going to make money because a lot of people expect these services to be for free. What happens for WhatsApp is that when $18 billion was presented from Facebook by Mark Zuckerberg that they're going to buy WhatsApp, which by the way was a compliment, not a competitive overtake, because Facebook has this post-it like site, like really crappy like messaging service. They have WhatsApp. They want to converge and they want to make their services better. WhatsApp people just got $18 billion for their services. They provided a service that people can now use actively. They're happy. Facebook's happy, people can still use WhatsApp, everyone is happy. There is no problem here. What do I mean by this? If you leave these people alone, they won't innovate. Because no matter how many good ideas you have, if you return on assets, in other words, you need to pay the bank interest while you're waiting for this kind of income stream to start, you're going to go out of business. If you have equity problems and you put all your life savings into this company and you need to wait for 6 to 7 years for traction to happen, you're going to go out of business. In other words, people with ideas will not start up because they don't know how to make money out of this. Instead, let the big major players buy them out. Let companies like Facebook take Instagram, because Instagram was basically an idea where we had perfected camera technology, and now these people want to go back to the 1970s and make hipsters out of everyone. Fine. Let them buy it, people get to use it, the people that invented Instagram gets to profit, and we get to keep on having more incentives for people with small niche ideas, which are interesting in consumers' life, to actually consume. The people that make these kind of services, which require humongous traction for them to add income on their own, now have a bigger incentive to start popping out ideas in small startups and set them up so that the bigger companies can buy them out. This is good for everyone. Now, my first speaker talked about general aspects of why mergers and acquisitions are good. We told you explicitly why, especially when they said startups of SNS sites also require income stream. You're not growing things on trees. How do you do that? When you do it alone, you need to wait and die out. Good ideas under singularities do not reach the consumers compared to where you have big companies that want these technologies, where they want these services, and there are service providers that will provide that type of R&D or that type of idea. Everyone benefits. So initially, in the end of the day, it's this. Their idea of monopoly in a traditional market doesn't exist because of the characteristics of social networking sites don't work on monopolizing the sources of production of resources or in price fixing. But on the other hand, the reason why innovation improves in this dynamic or this paradigm is because startups and SNS sites, because they don't price their products, can't get income on their own. Okay, sorry. So in this case, it's actually good, and it's actually dangerous for mergers and acquisitions to be stopped, because then nobody benefits. And for these reasons, we're proud to thank you.
We thank the leader of opposition for his speech to wrap up the case.
Can I get move your 5 minutes? It's okay. Can I start?
problem inside opposition's case, Mr. Speaker, is that they only want to argue on the best case scenarios under opposition side. The best case scenario when both companies want to collude, want to come together and want to be merged so that both of them profit. But they never dealt with our worst case scenarios, when one company has no other option on the table but to get merged or to get bankrupt, and then that's the way they get crowded out, and that's when their competition flies right out of the window. Or when consumers have no other choice but to invest their privacy and their personal details into one conglomerate because there's no other viable social network where the rest of their community is active and is talking, is that kind of worst case scenario which we don't want consumers to be facing. Their response to that, well, it's still Facebook, people will still be using it, what's the big deal? We think they were very simplistic in signing off a lot of things that we were talking about, and we're going to deal with that first and foremost. First things first, let's look in the first clash about the impact on the industry level. So we're looking at competition, we're looking at R&D, we're looking at innovation. The first thing we need to do, Mr. Speaker, is to highlight to you the hypocrisy in their case. They want to tell you that it's easy for these companies to come up in the social media landscape because it's easy for us to start up databases, product differentiation is not such a big deal, operations are easy and cheap, and these industries have niche standards. Exactly because it's so easy for competition to thrive, we think then that moving on further, development of these social media sites is equally easy. So we think they can't have it both. They can't say that at the point of entry, it's really like easy for these companies to start up, but then to develop or to have R&D, it's suddenly more expensive. They never told us why that is necessarily true. But secondly, it's exactly because the conditions for competition is so good in social media that we need to ensure that they are encouraged. I.e., if R&D and innovation and the fact that it's a niche landscape makes it easy for small startups to actually have a chance at competing. You remove that when you make competition even harder, when competition becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, Mr. Speaker. What's the particular problem with that? We think, especially as we already told you in Prime Minister, that this policy is very time sensitive. I.e., what the thing that these social media companies who want to compete, never mind companies who want to get merged, that's not the point in this debate. If they want to get merged, they can wait for 5 years to get merged, Mr. Speaker. Our worst case scenario is that some companies make profits 5 years later. They're happy to take that cost. But for the companies who don't want to get merged and who want to go head on head with Facebook, the option for them, Mr. Speaker, is to either get crowded out or to go bankrupt. Why is that fair? We haven't heard a response to that. Sit. But here's the thing, if you really want R&D to be developed, the thing about social media apps and sites is that investors tend to be more willing to give funding when they see traction or potential. What does that mean? That means that at the point in which they are promising social media apps, like Instagram for example, the last thing you must do then is to allow them to be bought over. That's why when Instagram got bought over by Facebook, Mr. Speaker, you had a whole slew of investors who are willing to put in not as much funding, of course, but enough funding to hold Instagram through for the next 10 years. What happens now when Facebook's $18 billion takeover is the only option in the table is that these investors become extremely short-sighted, Mr. Speaker, and are willing to just make a quick buck and exit the industry. We think especially when individuals want more out there on the table, that's a bad thing. But lastly, right, we don't think it's innovation or creativity when you do it within the boundaries of a big company's profit-making framework. How is that innovation, Mr. Speaker? When you say, look, it's good for discourse, it's good for creativity, but within these boundaries, and that's where innovation ends. We think innovation happens when you come up with a new Facebook, Mr. Speaker, or when you have the chance to actually compete, and we don't think competition happens on that side of the house. Like, so sure, WhatsApp and Facebook both profited and they're both happy, but what about the unique circumstances when a company wants to go up against Facebook but doesn't have the funds or doesn't have the space in that industry to do so? They never dealt with that worst case scenario. Sit down. But here's the thing, right, and if you really want to talk about competition, we can deal with it. First things first, Mr. Speaker, we think then that it's unfair on a principle level to force companies to either compete with the big fish or to die out. We think that's particularly problematic. But secondly, if you really are talking about, oh, mergers and acquisitions for other industries are different because they have a monopoly over prices and things as such, but social media landscape doesn't have that. We call bullshit on that for a few things. One, that different industries have different nature of capital, Mr. Speaker. The capital in the social media industry is information monopoly, and we think it's not just about price monopoly or product monopoly that is particularly relevant in this debate. So sure, guys, we know oil is different from social media, but the idea of it is unfairly monopolizing over the capital in that industry, and if that capital here is information, that's particularly even more pernicious when privacy is at stake, because it's not just about prices or people's pockets, but people's virtual lives having the potential to be hijacked, Mr. Speaker, just because that capital is being harmed. Sure.
Are you going to stop companies from trading, selling, chartering, or leasing intellectual property or private information data that is currently legal without having to merge or acquisition?
We think that if these processes can be regulated, and if these individuals, if these particular processes, things like trading, for example, or the change of information technology happens, we think that's fundamentally different from an entire conglomerate owning your information assets. We think those processes are different, and don't try to like sneakily say that the exchange of information technology is the same thing as one media company owning like 8 different social media sites. We think that's particularly different. But here's the thing, contractual agreements are different, Mr. Speaker. And here's why we really move into the idea of why, at the end of the day, they have completely ignored the users and why they're the particularly most important player in this debate. Here's the reason why. Because, Mr. Speaker, we think it was a lie for them to just say people's privacy isn't that important. And here's why we think that's an important issue in this debate. Look, why won't regulation, which is their alternative, work? Because regulation of the social media landscape means that governments are forced to hijack privacy to begin with. At the entry level, Mr. Speaker, if the only option the state now has is to hack into Facebook and ensure that no hanky-panky is going on, we think that's a bad option for the state. So the best way to bring about privacy is to regulate at entry level of the industry, Mr. Speaker, and ensuring that one company doesn't own everything of that industry. If that's the only possible, feasible way of regulating this industry, we think states must take charge of cyber welfare. What does their side of the house do for this? It's not just about putting a photo of your lunch or about like talking about Jessica Simpson for Pete's sake. This is about the location, the private details, the photographs, the addresses and the phone numbers of these individuals, Mr. Speaker. Why as a responsible state should you compromise putting that kind of information into the hands of one conglomerate? Sure, some people might not be making that much money in the next 5 years, but if it means that other companies can come up and that individual cyber security isn't put at stake, we're happy to take that cost of lower profits for better security. I'm happy to propose.
We thank God for this speech.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 3 questions remaining in today's debate. First, regarding the necessity. Second, let's actually talk about how this is going to bring about more innovation. Finally, do consumers benefit through their notion? They don't. But before that, we need to clarify 2 things. Because what we never heard from them is how exactly producer innovation is going to reduce just because M&As are allowed. How exactly is the case that small fish will not be able to survive or grow into big fishes, where we are constantly seeing that landscape changing because simply consumers wanted one thing over the other. Consumers had different tastes and preferences over time. They never responded to that properly. But also, they never really told us how consumer utilities at the end of the day better in their side. They somehow magically imagined that 20 companies will arise between the 5 to 10 years period, which is a holistic lie if we actually observe empirically how these landscape have been changed throughout the past decades. But second level, when they said that M&As might fail, we think that it's not the burden of the negative side to prove that all M&As will successfully be beneficial for these companies. In other words, all investments necessarily fail. It is not the government's job to argue because your M&A might be detrimental for your investment, you should not have M&As. We think that at the end of the day, chief executives and again the respective companies are the better decision makers, and they should be allowed to make the decision if they want to. Thank you. Having said that, let's move on to the one by one. First, regarding the necessity. They kept on arguing lies about information. Let's be very clear about one thing, Mr. Speaker. If it's in the legal boundaries, we're perfectly happy to allow these companies to utilize their information whatever ways that they want. But if you're talking about illegal measures, if you're talking about negligences, for instance, if you're not keeping the information properly, we're happy to regulate them. We're happy to have legal recourses. We're happy to, again, give for all kinds of hell that Facebook might fear in the cases they're negligent at the end of the day expose a lot of information outside. Now, thank you. In other words, their entire information monopoly can be perfectly well regulated, and we think this is no no different from any other industry sector. We think this is no different from any other information acquisition. As long as it's legal, and again, in the cases it's illegal, we can perfectly punish them and no problem whatsoever. But on a second level, when they said it's keen to all companies, we numerously told you that it's, again, different because there's no monopolization of factors of production. In other words, the problem of all companies was that there was literally no way for you to enter. There is a lot of ways you can enter in the case of social network services, because at the end of the day, Facebook started with a dozen programmers. At the end of the day, there are next generation Mark Zuckerbergs. It was the small company Facebook that triumphed over MySpace, which was the dominant one, as they say, throughout, again, better marketing and throughout becoming more preferential towards the consumer taste. No, thank you. But on a third level, when they argued that it will be a media conglomerate, Facebook don't disseminate one single type of political ideology. MySpace don't necessarily go for certain propaganda. None of that argument actually stands. Comparatively, what have I told you regarding the necessity of M&As? No, thank you. We have told you that from time to time we need more financing powers. It is precisely because when you become a dinosaur, you have to devour enough to again survive. In other words, whereas we also see free competition happening precisely because it's easy to have free entry, once you become larger, you need to necessarily maintain yourself. In that particular instance, we think that these companies like Facebook necessarily need to have, again, better financing ways, again, to sustain itself. In other words, to a certain extent, we think that big is good because big gives you possibly more revenues. But at the same time, being big comes with a lot of responsibilities because you have to finance yourself. You have to continue yourself. Comparatively, again, that is the beauty why free entry is happening, because you don't have to have a lot of maintenance fee. You don't have to, again, go for a lot of financing at the startup level. That's why we think the free entry can happen also. So let's go more deeply onto that idea. No, thank you. Second idea regarding innovation. Because first they said we need insulation of these small companies in order to again survive. But that is only when, again, easy entry is not guaranteed. We never heard a proper response why easy entry is not happening. Because we told you on 2 levels of analysis why easy entry is going to happen. No, thank you. Because first we told you for small startups there will be more innovation because precisely you know that your innovation will be benefited because there will be buyers out there. In other words, we think it's perfectly fine if some programmers think that I want to go into this business and I want to share my knowledge precisely because I know that there is a buyer called Facebook, called Microsoft, or called Google, Mr. Speaker. In other words, what we argue against them is none of these acquisitions are necessarily hostile because there are also other companies other than Facebook that actually wants to go in there. In other words, in that circumstance, these programmers' ambitions necessarily become our innovation and our consumer utility. But on a second level, what we told you was this. Because we also have ambitious competitors, Mr. Speaker. In other words, it's not necessarily only programmers who all want to be merged and acquisitioned. There are also competitors who want to be next generation Mark Zuckerberg. Because Mark Zuckerberg started with dozens of, again, programmers only. Also, WhatsApp only generates, even in the status quo, with only about 30 personnel, Mr. Speaker. If that is true, we don't understand why it's impossible for you to, again, have perhaps a group of graduates from MIT and at the end of the day have a free entry, as much as Mark Zuckerberg did. And moving on to the third question, but before that, yes.
For the enterprising next Mark Zuckerberg, if he faces the scenario where Facebook has 80% of that industry, what are you doing to allow him to thrive?
So nicely moving on to the third question regarding consumer utility. Their holistic lie was this, that MySpace has been attacked and that's the reason it's gone. No, Mr. Speaker, MySpace was the dinosaur. MySpace was the dinosaur now facing this competitor, probably a Dawit, who was much smaller, called Facebook. The only reason MySpace at the end of the day faded away was because people liked the interface of Facebook better. People liked Facebook because it was easier to communicate with friends. And at the end of the day, the interface and the looks and whatever the graphics of Facebook was more appealing to the consumers. In other words, the reason their base case scenario cannot happen whatsoever is because the reason why people started to have Facebook as the dominant company in the status quo is because people wanted it, Mr. Speaker. In other words, just because you allow moratorium to go on for 5 to 10 years, that does not necessarily mean that there will be necessarily someone as hot as Facebook within that period. In other words, their base case scenario of having 20 new companies don't necessarily make sense because it's either A, Facebook rules for the next 5 years, or B, another competitor, another small fish at the end of the rise to the extent of Facebook, and that becomes the new dominant one because globally people have the consumer preference over that idea. But what we contribute on the opposition was this, that when these consumer preferences are gathered, we think that is for a reason. That is giving more, again, utility towards the consumers. Precisely because we told you on a first level that from time to time we have collusion of platforms. For instance, we have told you that from time to time, if you actually want to use multiple apps and multiple features through one company, that's a perfectly fine thing because that actually makes it easier to access it. But finally, we have also told you that the real reason why consumer utilities don't reduce is because it's inherently impossible to continue your monopoly. In other words, temporarily you can have small level of monopolies, which by the way, you cannot even price the people, and therefore you can have multiple benefits because the consumers are price sensitive. But at the end of the day, the side of the opposition is this. From time to time, we see dominance of A company over B. But B company always rises up, C company always rises up, precisely because it's easy free entry. Just because a company is poor in one particular period of time, that doesn't mean that it will continue, precisely because of the characteristics of social network service. If that's true, we are proud to oppose.
Right, thank you, opposition. Now it's time to speaker.
The affirmative team in this debate had a conception of oligopolistic and monopolistic practices in the status quo. The negative answered twofold. The first part of the answer was that their plan isn't antitrust legislation, doesn't do anything to tackle the big companies that would already, according to their own worldview, have a competitive advantage over small companies. No response to that from that side of the house. The second thing that we told you was that the characteristic of monopolistic practices didn't really apply in the social media industry, because this wasn't like the competition between small companies in the supermarket industries and big companies in the supermarket industry. Because we clearly told you, Mr. Speaker, that it wasn't a hostile takeover when WhatsApp was merged with Facebook. Small companies happily engage in these things to propagate their services into large platforms, although we do have innovation because the barrier to entry is always low. Big companies, regardless of mergers and acquisitions, always have to fear a new entering power, which is why we don't think that consumer choice and diversity is compromised under the perspective of a negative team. Two issues. Firstly, competition innovation. Secondly, information abuse, which was the most ridiculous point I've ever heard in this debate. The first issue in this debate is whether big mergers are necessarily bad. We gave you very good reasons as to why that wasn't the case. We told you that not all takeovers were hostile. And this lie about MySpace was fundamentally annoying because it was, even if it was a dinosaur, it failed to compete because it couldn't innovate. We think that's a testament to the integrity of the market mechanism, and we think that just goes for our case. But we also told you that this isn't like other industries, because there aren't factors of production owned, because the entry to barriers is incredibly low, because there are less startup costs. They said there was some sort of vague thing called the information monopoly. But we don't really understand why having consumer information means that other companies aren't able to attract customers. That wasn't fundamentally explained. It was just an invented explanation at their third speech. Then they told us that creativity compromised. We gave you a lot of analysis as to why actually small firms want this, because they can propagate their services. We gave you the analysis on return on equity. We gave you the analysis about how big companies want to synergize with smaller companies, and small companies are happy to do that. No response from this side of the house. Then we had decided that mergers and acquisitions unfairly skew the market. But 80% market share of Facebook is different from 80% market share everywhere else. At third and second, we clearly told you that not all mergers and acquisitions are successful. They're often failing because companies make the wrong decisions. No response from that side of the house. There is always a new champion in the social media industry. There's always a new guy, and there's always a fear of the new guy. We don't think big necessarily translates into monopolistic practices and restrictions of consumer choice. In fact, it is the opposite in the case of social media industries, because there's a unique structure of interrelationships between small companies and big companies that they never could respond to in this debate. But to the second and more minor issue in this debate, which is information exposure and abuse, we gave you a lot of examples as to how their model would not solve the leakage of information and the concentration of information. We gave you things like, if you have a problem with the leakage information, make it enforceable by law. Give help to SNS companies that are lax in protecting consumer information. Then we also told you that all other industries collect information. And actually, the news revealed recently was a problem of credit card companies and banks. It wasn't a problem of social networking sites. But we also told you that even under their model, people that hack into systems would still hack into information and get it. Like, just because you have a concentrated number of information in one company does not mean that every other company is not vulnerable to those shots. No response, and shrieks of silence from these guys. At the end of the day, the failure of the affirmative team comes from this. They didn't recognize the monopolistic structure of other industries is not analytically on similar terms with that of the social media industry. It's unique. It's always open to competition. We celebrate that on this side of the house. Mergers and acquisitions don't impede competition because there's always a new guy, and on reverse, they provide more innovation and more products and more services. We're happy to oppose.
Right. Next, let's speak from the opposition.
Mr. Speaker, side opposition has failed on two counts. They've not managed to protect the industry, and they've certainly not managed to protect its users either. And these were the two aims we set out at the start of the debate, and they had to at least try to prove to us why the industry is better if you do allow mergers and acquisitions in the short term, or why users are better off if you allow this. Now let's deal with both of these questions. Firstly, the idea of whether it's better for the industry. And really, let's look at the idea of competition, right? And here's where the hypocrisy on that side was appalling. Because first they came up and told us that, look, entry is really simple, and we agree with that, right? You don't need infrastructure, you don't need a huge amount of capital to set up a social media firm. We agree with that. But the point here is this: what happens after you set up that company? How do you survive in that industry? Under our paradigm, when you're not allowing mergers and acquisitions for this time period, you're allowing these companies to compete with several other companies who may be at the same level as them. Under their paradigm, you're allowing big companies like Google and Facebook to take over every small company, which means that large monopolies have about 70% of the market share. Which means that survival within this industry is so much harder for small companies under their paradigm. They don't defend, they don't protect, they don't ensure competition under their paradigm, and that's a failing on their part. But secondly, it was laughable when they came up and said that the threats of monopoly don't exist in social media, in the social media industry. Now that's ridiculous. We're not saying that a social media monopoly will manipulate prices and whatnot. We never said that. But the fact that one company has complete control over that platform, has complete control over the information within that, and by information we don't mean personal information of users. We mean the means for you to get something out, the means for you to reach other people and reach individuals. That is the kind of monopoly which is detrimental. If only one platform, only one company is given control of that entire arena, something they did not respond to. Now, on the idea of innovation, and this is even more laughable, because they came up and said that innovation is better under their idea, because once you've taken over a company, you can innovate more. The point is, big companies don't need to innovate under your paradigm, right? Because the only thing they have to do is take over all new ideas and promising ideas. They've got no incentive to invest in innovation. Under our paradigm, Mr. Speaker, all companies, because it's so competitive in our industry, have to innovate. They have to ensure that they're focusing on innovation. Facebook has not innovated anything for the last 2-3 years. They've just been taking over Instagram, taking over WhatsApp and stuff as such. What have they added that is new to that platform? Nothing at all. That's why we tell you it's important to insulate companies from the threat of mergers and acquisitions to ensure that innovation still comes up. Lastly, the idea of hostility versus willingness. Now they do nothing to defend individuals who are subject to hostile takeovers, right? They did nothing for them. We're at least protecting them. The only thing they wanted to do was to talk about how some people might be willing to merge or be acquired by other companies. In our paradigm, we still protect them. We're telling them, wait for 5 years. After the moratorium is over, you can happily subject yourself to a merger and acquisition. At least we cater to both of these groups. They only cater to one while completely overlooking the other. But on the second issue, the biggest issue, which was the other big issue, which was that on what's beneficial and what's best for users, and this is something they sorely overlooked. They completely strawman the idea of information and privacy being abused in this industry. They said that what's going to come out of random tweets about Sarah Jessica Parker? That's not the point. The point is, Mr. Speaker, when one company has complete control over all the information of your life from various aspects, it's extremely detrimental because the ability for that information to be targeted is so much more. Right? If a terrorist or anyone else who wants to abuse this information, all he has to do is to target that one company. In our paradigm, there are many companies, the information is distributed, and the abuse of that information is so much more. In OpWhip, we had a lame response coming up and telling us, and maybe we can regulate this. Here's the point, you can't regulate it. The best thing that you can do to take certain defensive precautionary mechanisms is to ensure that that information is not concentrated in one company and distributed all over. They fail to tell us how the industry is better off in terms of competition or innovation. They fail to protect users. I'm extremely proud to win.
Thanks to technology, speeches, closing and very organization.